Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Helen Howard from Chatham House, and I'm delighted to be facilitating today's event. So this is a joint event held in partnership with the Lao China Institute and King's College London. And we have a fantastic group of panelists who will cover between them the policy background in China with some examples of this in practice, before moving to the upcoming 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity hosted by China later this year, then moving to the UK context and the role of nature in the UK's UNFCCC COP26 presidency, and an acknowledgement of the links between this and the CBD COP15. So each panelist is going to speak for up to 10 minutes with their opening remarks before we move to the Q&A. And please do continue to submit your questions throughout the event using the Q&A function, rather than trying to use the chat or raise hand function. And just to note that this event will be held on the record and recorded for publication on the Chatham House website. So our first speaker is Dr. Han Meng, who is Executive Director of the WCMC in Beijing, with an overall responsibility of WCMC's Beijing's operation and development in China. Prior to this role, Han served as the China representative of UNEP WCMC and led the regionalization strategy and its implementation in and with China. Han, we're delighted to have you join us today. Please go ahead, over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen. So I'm going to pop out my camera to then start sharing a few slides. Thanks very much to Chatham House for this opportunity to share my understanding on this very important topic. So I'm going to keep my talk brief and look forward to the interactions later on. Let's first look at the evolving process of China's climate and biodiversity policies along the timeline. We shall look at both areas together to understand the synergy question raised by the organizer. So let's look into details. So first, the upper side of this slide is actually on the climate policy. China's climate policy has undergone two stages. The first phase is the exploration period for institution and mechanism preparation. And this phase was actually from 1992 to 2008. During this period, China's climate policy primarily aimed at regardless reduction by saving and efficiency. And moving to the right-hand side, we also, from 2009, that's the starting point of China's climate policy reaching its second phase. This is the transition period for more strategic decision-making. So during this phase, the policy target shifted to carbon and energy intensity of GDP as efficiency and structure being adjusted. And also during this phase, the nationwide medium and long-term low carbon strategy started to be developed. Now let's look at the bottom part, the green part in this slide. That's the biodiversity policy. So in parallel, China's biodiversity policies are also going through its exploration phase pretty much around the same time period. In late 1980s, the release of China's first program for nature protection that actually marked the formal starting point of China's biodiversity policies. In 1992, China signed up to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, so as one of the very early signatories. So this is another major milestone in terms of China's biodiversity policies. Since then, we can see the rise of the release of a series of policy measures to enhance biodiversity protection in China. And also in this phase, biodiversity started to gain attention in China's major development strategy. In 2010, China released its first national biodiversity strategy and action plan that actually covers the time period from 2011 to 2030. And that in many ways actually marked China entering into a more proactive stage in terms of its biodiversity policy. So let's keep going. As the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 and the emission peaks go into implementation, China also entered the third phase of its climate policy. And the key emphasis of this phase is that its regulations started gradually transitioned to cap control. Now let's look at the proactive development also very much around the same time period again for biodiversity policy, which is getting more and more proactive from 2010 onwards. In 2012, I just mentioned a few milestone moments. The formal endorsement of the ecological civilization concept is a very important milestone for China's biodiversity policies, because this is a moment for the very first time in China has clearly demonstrated the highest level of political position regarding the protection of biodiversity and ecological environment in China. And since then, we can see China's biodiversity policies have been significantly and systematically strengthened. For example, the integration of biodiversity consideration in terms of both conservation and sustainable use are further and increasingly integrated into the subsequent 5-year plans, the 12th, 13th, and recently the 14th 5-year plan until 2025. Another major moment during this phase is 2018, which marks another important moment for China's biodiversity policies, because this year, China adopted a major government reform. For biodiversity policies, the major relevant changes include the establishment of the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. For the very first time, the word ecology actually appears in China's government structure. So you can see the significance and the change. For on the climate change side, for climate policies, the government functions have been also shifted into the newly established Ministry of Ecology and Environment. So this restructure really forms a very important institutional basis for driving synergies between climate change and the biodiversity related policies and actions. Also worth noting that on the global stage, China has started playing an increasing leadership role in both climate change and biodiversity topics, as well as more recently driving for that synergy between them. This has been observed from various major events, for instance, from 2015, the adoption of Paris Agreement, China being one of the major drivers for that, and to more recent China's announcements of its carbon neutrality goal by 2060 and the carbon emission peak before 2030, as well as China being the host of the upcoming CBD COP15, when the world leaders are going together and are expected to agree on very ambitious biodiversity goals for the next decade. So these are all very exciting progresses, and obviously there are also challenges along the way. Now let's have a very quick overview about this. In China's 6th national report to the CBD, it was highlighted, this is based on data by 2020, corresponding to Aichi targets is organized that way. China does have its national targets, but for easy comparison or assessment, it's done the 6th national report based on the Aichi targets structure. So 65% of these targets in China are on track in China, and 15% on track to exceed target. 20% have been progressing but inefficient. So that's the current latest assessments. And And in that report, it also highlighted several key challenges as China encountered in terms of biodiversity conservation or implementation of CBD. So very quickly, these challenges include, for instance, the legal and regulatory system in China. It has been highlighted that there have been gaps in laws and regulations for meeting the current circumstances because things change quickly. And there are also gaps in specialized laws and regulations, particularly on access and benefit sharing, wetland conservation, and managing invasive species. There's another challenge, which is a lack of coherent coordination and market-oriented approach for funding flowing into biodiversity, and inadequate conservation infrastructure, particularly for protected areas, inadequate scientific technical support capacities. For example, the lack of large-scale baseline data for biodiversity in China. It has been observed as one of the key challenges. Another one I want to emphasize is the conflicts between socio-economic development and the conservation. This is particularly related to, for instance, the conflicts around land use, for example, economic social development activities versus protected areas. So that's a very quick overview in terms of the progresses so far and the challenges. Now let's quickly look at future. So what China is going to do. China has recently released its 14th five-year plan, which basically guides the country's development strategies and actions in all aspects for the next 5 years until 2025. We can see from this indicator graph that ecology is one of the major areas of focus for China's next 5 years, along with economic development, innovative drive, well-being, and security. So it is really put at a very high position. There are various actions and initiatives taking place at subnational level as well in China. So I won't talk too much on this aspect, but just want to give a couple of examples that we've been working with the governments of Chengdu and Shenzhen in advising the investments into green infrastructure that contributes to both biodiversity and climate change goals, as well as in advising the policy actions for integrating evaluation of nature into land use planning process. So that does show the interest and passion from sub-national governments as well. So I won't dive into too much detail due to the timing, but just want to mention these examples as they relate to, I think, the third question raised by the organizer for this session. I'm going to stop here and back to Helen.
Thanks so much, Hen. Fantastic. So next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Li Goa, a research associate with the Lao China Institute at King's College London and a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at University of British Columbia. Li's research centers on biodiversity protection, genetically modified food policies, and national parks regulation. Li, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Lao China Institute at King's College London and Chatham House for organizing such a great event. And I especially like to thank Hannah Breslin and Lucy Rideout for their excellent organizational work, and also to Helen Hawat for chairing our panel and kind introduction. And it's also a great pleasure to be here in this panel with real policy experts and practitioners from all around the world and China. And as a political scientist, I'm interested in issues of public participation and expert consultation in scientifically complex issue areas, and was particularly interested in on the norm diffusion on China's biodiversity governance. And as Han has nicely laid out the overview of China's progress on both conservation and climate fronts. Today, my focus will be on China's recent reforms in its key biodiversity conservation institutions and offer some analysis of the political dynamics and agency behind this massive institutional overhaul. And if time allows, I'll briefly discuss implications of this reform for a synergy of biodiversity conservation and climate solutions. China's rise as an economic and political superpower coincided with a deepening global environmental crisis, both unparalleled in human history. And entering the Xi Jinping era is also the provoke stage of the biodiversity conservation, as Han described. In this era, China has surprised the world with its environmental leadership, particularly with its climate change pledges. Less well known are China's equally significant steps at home to upgrade its environmental governance, with biodiversity at the forefront of this reform. People may not know that first, China is one of the 12 most biodiverse countries on the planet. And secondly, biodiversity conservation is one of China's fastest growing sectors. Over the past 35 years period between 1978 and 2013, for instance, China's coverage rate of the terrestrial protected areas grow from 0.13% to 17%, at about 130 fold growth. Yet China's biodiversity status is quite concerning, as it is also one of the countries in the world where biodiversity is more threatened. Many factors contributed to this, but as the primary institutions supporting biodiversity conservation, China's protected areas remained largely ineffective despite the exponentially fast growth of conservation areas in size, types, and number over the past few decades. And why was that the case? So aside from the perennial problems of lack of funding and local captivity for economic development, China's conservation areas were set up in a fragmented bureaucratic system and embedded in the decentralized management structure, and it lacked the effective coordination at the top. And that is why China's conservation was long known as a case of 9 dragons governing one water, with fragmented institutions and a very low capacity. In recent years, China has aggressively tackled the institutional problems in natural resources and nature conservation administration. Since the 18th Party Congress, China has officially rolled out national park system reforms with pilot parks in 9 provinces, and further plan to construct a unified protected area system with national park as the main components. Sorry about the noise. This was soon followed by a massive administrative restructuring at the state council level in 2018. Probably the biggest in the PRC's history. In this sweeping reform, the conservation-related functions were moved from their original management departments and regrouped under one single agency, the National Forestry and Grassland Administration, under the newly created the Ministry of Natural Resources. And China also created a brand new National Parks Administrative Agency in charge of all national parks and protected areas. And as a forward-thinking endeavor, the state also made a roadmap and laid out step-by-step plans for the construction of a protected areas system with Chinese characteristics by 2035, and the scale and administration of which would meet the world advanced standards. And the Chinese government also making moves in legislation on national parks and protected areas respectively, presumably within a coherent protected areas framework. And with all the actions taking place, China is entering an era of biodiversity, new era of biodiversity conservation. With this current national park and protected area reform, China has a chance to reset the entire conservation system and solve some of the deep-rooted institutional problems. To be sure, this system upgrade, even if completely successful, is far from being enough for China to win the uphill battle against unprecedented biodiversity loss. But it is a much needed key step to set the country on the right path toward any meaningful target of conservation or nature-based climate solutions. However, this reform outcome is nothing natural or inevitable. Instead, it was a surprising outcome of a challenging long process. Since the early 2000s, China has made repeated attempts to reform its conservation system, going through legislative proposals for nature reserve law, a protected area law, and a natural heritage conservation law. Due to the bureaucratic fights, none of the reforms succeeded. So why did it succeed this time around? With limited time, I will just sketch out a few dynamics that contributed to this swift streamlining reform. First of all, as Han pointed out, the increased political salience of environmental governance and biodiversity conservation created opportunities to break the bureaucratic deadlocks. With economic growth slowed down and environmental degradation becoming a major source of stress to the regime, environmental governance has become a focus of Xi Jinping's new era. Essentially, the national park reform, at least from the perspective of domestic policy community, was treated as one of the two signature reforms to Xi Jinping's ecological civilization campaign, in par with his climate policy. This level of saliency creates a window opening opportunity in the sense of great imperatives for actions and timely output, as well as a change of incentive structure of the reform decision makers to seek more legitimate solutions, policy solutions. And secondly, China's decision-making has been increasingly relying on expert consultation. And this allows scientists, policy experts, scholars, as well as professional organizations to play an increasingly important role in decision-making. And the national parks and protected area reform was characterized with a pattern of repeated consultations through intensive forum, symposium, conference discussion, followed by decisions and further consultation. While this did not guarantee a successful reform, there was another dynamic that helped, and that was the rise of an epistemic community in China's conservation field. So when China first started institutionalized conservation efforts, it had a very small talent pool, and the experts were mostly isolated by departmental divides. Over the years, through international collaborations, state cultivation, and strong domestic demands, a community of conservation experts has emerged, and they're frequently tapped for consultation and decision-making. And in particular, a group of conservation experts who believed that China needed a unified protection area system, they actively advocated, lobbied, and campaigned for such reforms. So with this big political openings at the top and a consultative decision-making process and a rising epistemic community, China finally closed an institutional gap between its fragmented conservation system and international accepted protected area system. I've just stopped in here and I'll probably touch on the implications in the Q&A session. Thank you. Back to you, Helen.
Thanks so much, Lee, for another really interesting talk. Looking forward to getting into the discussion, and please keep dropping your questions in the Q&A box as we progress through the sessions. So our next panelist is Catalina Santamaria, a senior program officer and special advisor to the Office of the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, UN Environment Programme, where she's helping shape the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Prior to this, she led the Forest Programme for the Secretariat, managing the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, and served as Vice Chair of the Global Partnership on Forest Restoration. Catalina, it's fantastic to have you with us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and good day to all joining us to this webinar. My appreciation to the Chatham House and King's College London, and to all the panelists for all these very rich and dynamic discussions and interventions. Today, I'd like to share some updates on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is under negotiations through the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'd also like to add to the discussion on synergistic measures on biodiversity and climate action, including on nature-based solutions and the role of China in international cooperation. As many of you know, the Convention on Biological Diversity is a Rio Convention. It was adopted at the Earth Summit in 1992 to build international political attention and action on biological conservation, sustainable use, and to foster a fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. Among its area of focus, the Convention addresses material and non-material values, which life on Earth provides to both present and future generations, including the rich diversity connected to traditional knowledge systems and values. 2 weeks ago, delegates to the CBD process concluded the first formal virtual part of negotiations under the subsidiary body meetings on technological and technical advice and on implementation. These are the SUPSTAs and the SBI. This critical step in the lead up to COP15, as a result of the work advanced in these subsidiary body meetings, has produced important advice to the co-chairs of the working group on the post-2020 framework. Work will continue virtually at the third meeting of the working group, which is scheduled from the 23rd of August to the 3rd of September. At that meeting, delegates will work on the basis of a first draft, which is currently being prepared by the co-chairs and which builds upon earlier drafts and the discussions at SUPSTA and SBI. Looking ahead, it is anticipated that a physical meeting will be needed to complete the work of the working group and of the subsidiary bodies before the final version of the framework can be presented for adoption at COP15. So in this context, the Bureau of the COP is currently examining scenarios to develop the timetable for the meetings ahead of and at COP itself. Such plans will ensure effective preparation and convening of COP15 with full participation of all stakeholders. So now turning to the theme of the event, let me share 3 points, and I think they resonate very well with the two previous speakers. My first point is that climate change and the degradation of our natural environment have many issues in common. As science has revealed, these crises have a common origin and must be addressed as one interconnected problem with linked solutions. From the origin point of view, we know that our human actions are the basis of the challenges before us. Climate change, deforestation, land and sea use change, unsustainable production and consumption, unsustainable agriculture, livestock production, and the illegal wildlife trade are just some of the results of our actions. We also know that climate change impacts can undermine ecosystem resilience and thus further weaken the contribution of ecosystems to both mitigation and adaptation of climate change. All of this has a direct influence on the ecosystem health and the ecosystem goods and services upon which we all depend. Just on an economic front, the loss of biodiversity poses huge economic risks. And I think Dr. Li mentioned this in the context of China and looking at the reforms and the context of change that she explained. And in reports that we have been receiving and analyzing, we have noticed that more than half of the world's total gross domestic product, or 44 trillion, involves activities that are moderately or highly dependent on nature. The Dutch Central Bank, for example, put out a study which noted that the loss of biodiversity and related ecosystem services are, like climate change, material risk for the financial sector, with huge consequences for the economy if they're not taken seriously. Now, another common point between climate change and biodiversity loss is that the consequences from climate change and biodiversity loss are felt by all people, whether with in particular those most vulnerable and marginalized bearing the biggest burdens, creating further inequity and social economic complexities. The distributional impacts from a decline in biodiversity have a particular detrimental effect on Indigenous people and local communities, given their reliance on biodiversity for their well-being. In this case, reports also indicate that on a business as usual trajectory, biodiversity and the services it provides will continue to decline. And this would jeopardize the achievement of close to 80% of the Sustainable Development Goals. This will create enormous implications, which we can discuss in Q&A. My second point is that there are options available to the global community to simultaneously reduce biodiversity loss, limit climate change, and improve the capacity to adapt to it and meet other goals, such as improve food security. There is also recognition and support to keep climate change well below 2 degrees Celsius and close to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels to prevent climate impacts from overwhelming all other actions in support of biodiversity. The conservation and restoration of ecosystems can play a substantial role in these efforts. Our studies have recognized that nature-based solutions could provide about 1/3 of the total net emission reduction effort required to keep climate change close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, with appropriate safeguards in place, they could also enhance a wide range of ecosystem services, including water filtration, flood and coastal protection, and soil health, as well as contribute to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Aside from enhanced conservation and restoration of ecosystems and climate change mitigation, measures should also include actions to mitigate pollution, to mitigate invasive alien species, and to reduce overexploitation. In addition, measures should leverage more sustainable production of goods and services, especially food, and reduce consumption and waste. So this leads me to my third point. To address the climate and biodiversity crises in concert will require a long-term vision with multidisciplinary teams that can offer evidence-based solutions to address socioeconomic complexities, providing affordable and accessible options to build a resilient environment able to adapt to future impacts and shocks. International cooperation is critical for our efforts to simultaneously address the implications of climate change, biodiversity loss, and other global development challenges. Enhanced cooperation through scientific and technical exchanges and knowledge, optimizing the use of resources that align regional and national goals can help to assess, to manage, and to report on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. The Chinese government provides a unique example in attaching political importance to strengthening efforts for climate action and ecological and environmental conservation. Actively responding to climate change is an integral requirement for China to achieve sustainable development, an important driver for stepping up the development of an ecological civilization and achieving the goal of a beautiful China. It is a historic responsibility for China to fulfill its role as a major country in promoting the building of a community with a shared future for mankind. China's 14th five-year plan provides a fundamental direction where one of the major goals is on ecological civilization. Both climate change and biodiversity conservation are integrated in the five-year plan with specific targets and tasks. In addition, its 2030 long-range objectives have identified specific measures to advance green development and to promote the harmonious coexistence of man and nature. The Chinese government also regards the realization of its carbon emission peak and carbon neutrality as an effective means to promote high-quality development, which emphasizes synergies between pollution reduction and carbon emission reduction. It is also taking comprehensive measures to achieve the integration and coordination of climate change and ecological and environmental protection. And I think we have heard a lot from our previous speakers on how China is recognizing climate change as well as its established nature conservation system and the implementation of major biodiversity projects as important tasks. So to conclude, the post-2020 global biodiversity framework will be key in helping us transform our relationship with nature and bringing us closer to the shared vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. The current zero draft of the post-2020 framework includes language for targets to reduce the impacts from climate change on biodiversity and to use nature-based solutions. Effective steps and synergies across conventions will be needed to address all remaining pressures driving biodiversity loss. The incoming COP15 and COP26 provide an opportunity to build greater coherence for implementing pathways towards a low carbon future compatible with biodiversity conservation by recognizing the value of biodiversity, safeguarding and restoring functionality of ecosystems, and enhancing long-term resilience. I thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Catalina. And now we'd like to welcome Ruth Davis. Ruth is an advisor to the Nature Campaign within the UK government's COP26 team, where she works with international partners to help drive action on forest and ecosystem protection. She also currently serves as lead on Nature for International Climate Politics Hub and as an advisor to the CECG on nature strategies. Ruth, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. As you know, I have apologies to send from my colleague in the UK's Environment Department who was going to join you, Andrea Ledwood. She can't make it, unfortunately, today, so I'm sorry you have me as a poor substitute. I work as an advisor seconded into the government rather than an embedded member of it, so I might have less ability to be able to sort of answer and be accountable for all aspects of government policy, but I will definitely try and give you a flavour of where the COP presidency is at the moment for COP26 around these critical issues on the interface between nature and climate. I think probably the first point to make is a very simple one when sitting inside a sort of presidency responsible for one of these large conferences, and particularly this conference on climate. As time goes by, it becomes more and more obvious, I think, that these conferences have to begin to fill the gap between rhetoric and what's actually being delivered on the ground. We're having a useful and really interesting, but arguably slightly academic kind of conversation in a way here. And I just want to bring a little bit of the politics of the outside into the inside and say that, kind of there is an expectation from citizens around the world now that actually we do start to join these things up, and we have to begin to move beyond targets to the space of implementation. And I do think that is thoroughly understood within the UK COP presidency. And in this particular context, the gap is fairly clear, isn't it? If we want to try to keep temperature rises below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible, and really take action for the most vulnerable who are being impacted by climate change, the ambition has to increase from where we are now, because what's on the table in terms of national commitments isn't sufficient to meet the goals that we've set ourselves as a community. And I guess that means from a political perspective that everybody involved in this situation is going to have to strain every effort, every sinew, if you like, to find new ways of closing that gap that are not just necessarily about new sort of national contributions, but they also involve really looking at institutional change and looking at sectoral action and cooperation in a way that's going to start to fill this sort of gap that risks becoming a chasm, if you like, between what we've said we're going to do and what we're actually going to do. And nature and land use, the protection and restoration of ecosystems and the transition to more sustainable land use are a critical part of how we might set out to fill that gap. I think there's too often been a feeling that we sort of need to deal with the energy system first, and then we'll get round to looking at the land use system. Well, we don't have time to do that in this space. This really is now a situation in which we have to take action on all fronts. And as colleagues have pointed out, 25% of GHG emissions currently coming from the land use sector, and a potential for 30% of the mitigation action before 2030 that we need to keep us on track to 1.5 sits in these sectors. So anybody working in and around the climate space now has to see these issues really as completely the front line. I think it's also the case that we're understanding much more than we have done previously, as Catalina and others have pointed out, that nature is not a nice to have. It is a fundamental underpinning of the global economy. 40% of that economy, according to the Dasgupta review and other reviews of a similar kind that are looking at the intersection between economics and biodiversity, 40% of our economy is directly or mostly nature dependent. And some of the kind of reality of that is brought home to us by an understanding of the role that nature degradation potentially plays in zoonosis of diseases, and that's obviously a very kind of sort of salient and important thing for us at the moment as we struggle with the crisis around COVID. So nature is not just essential for solving the climate crisis; it's also actually fundamental to the economy. And we should also remember that we're talking about sectors here when we're talking about the intersection with nature that are foundational for the lives and livelihoods of billions of people across the world, both in the sort of extended food system, but very particularly in communities of some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, subsistence farmers, smallholder farmers, where what we're talking about is literally the stuff of life for those people. And that means that the moment at which COP26 and COP15 are kind of coming together, if you like, is a particularly important and sort of synergistic moment, because it speaks to the need for urgency in these areas and these sectors in a way that perhaps has not happened before in the international community. For the UK COP presidency, therefore, these sectors, these issues have become a very major focus for the work that it wants to do in its role as the presidency, in convening state actors and non-state actors to come together to take more imperative action for climate change. I think this action that we're seeking to sort of drive within the COP26 space has to speak to the sort of two sides of a coin, if you like, to the protection and restoration of ecosystems on the one hand, and their importance for biodiversity and as carbon sinks, but also very much the other side of that, speaking to the need for a transition to sustainable agriculture and means of production, both because that's critically what matters to people's livelihoods, and because you can't really manage a process of protecting ecosystems if you're not able to work in a sensible way with those who manage the land in and around those ecosystems. So those are sort of two parts of the same coin, really, for the UK presidency. And I think we're kind of seeking to move these debates forward through a particular political approach that's very strongly focused on cooperation. There has been and maybe will continue to be a perception in some places that we're dealing with an agenda in which northern rich countries who for many years have kind of perhaps degraded their own environment and cut down their own forests and lost their ecosystems spend time lecturing other countries about what the right answer to their problems are. And that paradigm isn't one that appears to have been working brilliantly well for us. So I think we're seeking very cooperative approaches through things like the Forest, Agriculture and Commodities Trade Dialogue, which is, for example, looking at the supply chains of commodities that drive an impact on deforestation, where we're trying to bring together a conversation between producer countries on the one hand, producing these commodities, and consumer countries on the other, to look at whether or not actually a positive attitude to trade and investment in livelihoods is one way of tackling these problems. And clearly China is a potentially very, very important player in that dialogue. Similarly, the approach we're taking to agriculture around the Just Rural Transition Initiative is very much focused on thinking about lives and livelihoods in that space. All of this action for the UK government is then underpinned by an agenda of financial and economic reform, whether that's increasing the amount of public finance available to support nature, looking to see how we can bring more private finance into the space. I'm looking at mainstreaming, including through the sorts of decisions that are made by both public and private financial institutions around investments into the land space. And I think also a very important thing here is to recognise the challenges and the kind of critical questions around integrity. The way in which we act on land is very important in the context of the net zero challenge. We need to make sure that net zero is moving us forward in a way which is driving action in all sectors and not simply trading action against one sector for another. And we're very conscious of that issue. And then finally, kind of just moving to think about what the UK government's role is in relation to the CBD and how these things come together. The UK is also, kind of an advocate of a very strong, a very forward-looking, and a very kind of supportive framework under the CBD, and wants to work very closely with the Chinese presidency on these issues. Supporter of a strong 2030 mission for halting and reversing biodiversity decline, and 30 by 30 as the sort of core protected areas target that sits within that. And UK government works in many of the coalitions that advocate for that. I think there's also a couple of areas of sort of particular opportunity for synergies around looking at the joint finance agenda, because finance needs to drive change across both of these conventions. And then thinking very strongly about how one takes this down into national action and implementation, where we're essentially talking about the same land, the same people, the same oceans. And so we can't plan independently at a national level to do climate change mitigation in the nature space separately from biodiversity conservation. We actually have to bring these things together. And that creates massive opportunities for joint working. I think it's an incredibly challenging time for any government to be trying to host an international conference, as I'm sure colleagues in China will know well, but also this renewed focus on understanding the relationship between people, nature and climate, I think gives us a huge chance to do more in this area. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and to all our panelists for really fascinating opening remarks. So just to get us started off with the Q&A session, I wondered if anyone wanted to comment or had any thoughts on the level of optimism for the next round of biodiversity targets. So a lot of you have mentioned that there's this growing evidence base and increased understanding of all of the interlinkages with biodiversity and public health and climate change. And I wondered if is that kind of reflected in increased ambition around biodiversity targets? So is there sort of an expectation, is there a feeling of increased optimism ahead of the CBD COP15? Would anybody like to make any comments on that? Catalina, what's your sense of how things are shaping up compared to the previous round? Do you feel like there is more kind of understanding around the issues, and is that leading to this sort of increased expectation of more ambitious targets and more optimism for the outcomes?
Well, thank you, Helen. And I indeed wanted to give the opportunity to panelists to also provide their views from outside the process, but I'm happy to respond from my perspective. In my view, I do see ambition growing, and I do see this optimism really starting to stack. One, from the basis of our last COP and the work moving forward, on one hand, the COVID situation has really provided a very focused attention on the role of biodiversity for human health, but also those implications on equity in terms of leaving no one behind. Obviously, there is vaccine inequity, and there are a lot of implications from COVID that has spiraled into many negative socioeconomic aspects for many regions and many people. in addition to the financial system. And a lot of the points that I mentioned on the economic risks that we've seen coming from many reports that have been commissioned by governments as well as from the private sector. In a concrete example, I also want to mention that in 2020, we had the Biodiversity Summit in the UNGA. This was the first ever Biodiversity Summit held in this context. And we saw a rise of heads of state providing their support and their commitment, determination with a 10-point action plan to prepare not only for the COP, but also to seek more integrated measures. So as Ruth mentioned, it was no longer to commit with an empty promise, but really committing with a plan and committing with a way to clearly be accountable for what that plan means globally, but also individually in terms of domestic actions. And I think that that is what we need more of, is that there is that homework back at the domestic front to demonstrate the transitions that are necessary to break away from the silos that Lee mentioned in terms of our past systems working on specific issues on their own and trying to be more transversal in terms of how to address biodiversity, due to the fact that we know that most of the impacts on biodiversity are outside the environment sector, and therefore working more across sectors will be vital. So this transformation in mind shift, this theory of change has been embedded in the post-2020 framework. There are the elements grounded. Now it's real implementation, it's partnerships, it's integration. And I think with the examples that have been shared, it's not only top down with strong political leadership, but also bottom up with local governments, with youth, with civil society, with the private sector engaged in making that ambition even further, taking that extra mile of complementary actions to strive to a common vision, which we have set for 2030 and 2050, in unison with our other Rio Convention secretariats in the context of the Paris Agreement and also of the land degradation neutrality strategy and goals. So I think all the elements are there. Now it's really, and the leadership is there, the political determination is there. Now it's finding the other levers that we need to make those transitions really take shape. And I think on that point, I think it's very important to mention that a lot of this hinges on resource mobilization. And we know that many countries also have the ambition, but that ambition needs to be backed by the resources that they can leverage, not only domestically, but also from other sources. So these are some of the real challenges that we see, but I am hopeful that we will overcome this and that we will find the solutions to take forward the post-2020 framework into quick implementation so that we can see changes in the curve of loss of biodiversity start to turn the other way by 2030. Thank you.
Thanks, Catalina. Would anybody else like to comment on this one?
I'll quickly say while others are thinking. I agree very much with what Catalina has been saying here. I mean, arguably under the CBD, the big challenge is turning this into kind of reality and implementation, and not necessarily, you know, kind of the challenge of agreeing the sort of global mission. Because as our experience of sort of previous rounds of this was that, you know, it was relatively easy to agree, if you like, a set of kind of empty targets. What was hard was then actually driving through all of these processes that we've been talking about here. So I agree on the reasons for optimism. I also just think that, you know, the nature of the discussion that we've just had and the depth and quality of the analysis that our colleagues have given around a policy in China is an example of how much more mature this conversation is now than it has been previously, because what we're actually looking at and discussing is what's happening in terms of sort of institutional reform and delivery on the ground. And if we can get to that level of depth in a conversation with every country about their biodiversity policy, and then also really think about this question about how we integrate that into climate strategies, I think we'll be you know, kind of moving forward in a really important way. one very specific thing that it's worth raising in this context is the willingness and appetite for people to be spatially explicit about the things that need to happen. I think there's some very interesting work that's taken place in China, which our colleagues might be able to talk to us about there, where there's a kind of a sort of acknowledgement that actually one needs to understand the places where things are going to happen and really be prepared to kind of map that across in terms of sort of climate and land use and kind of work that through in a sort of detailed way. I'm not sure that that's a mature conversation yet, but I think it's one that's going to happen increasingly. And as it does happen, I think that'll demonstrate the willingness really to sort of take this seriously on the ground. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. So, Lee?
Oh, just echoing some the colleagues before, and since the world eyes are all on China for his critical role on both biodiversity and climate solutions, I offer some of my insight from the domestic side of China's role. So first of all, the Chinese focus on ecological civilization is big moves in making carbon reductions and pledges, as well as this high profile of the COP15 in Kunming in this fall, indicate that there's a big political opening in China for its environmental leadership and the domestic actions. And if China wants to demonstrate its leadership role in any meaningful way, especially on the global biodiversity front, and the protected area reforms, as I laid out earlier at home, is what he can rely on. He can rely on and be assured of the most. So given what this reform has accomplished, I think China is in a more confident position to pursue more ambitious role in setting the target and achieving target, at least from this institutional front. And one good news from my research is that there are policy communities, particularly the expert epistemic community on the biodiversity issues behind China's these political decisions on both on climate and the nature-based solutions. These experts have been vocal and active, and under the big political openings, it's hard to imagine that they do not seize the opportunity to impact the political decisions, and that's another positive force underlining the upcoming COP15 and the China's future climate policies. We can recall that at the initial outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, it was allegedly originated from the local seafood market in Wuhan city. And it is our conservation experts who, within no time to take action, they proposed immediate illegal wildlife trade ban in February, and initiated the corresponding revision of the China's Wildlife Protection Act in March 2020. So as the research of the recent joint workshop at the two UN science policy groups indicates the biodiversity and climate change are the interconnected issues and need to be tackled together. And I think my research on the national parks reforms indicate that the active scientific communities are essential, increasingly essential to China's environmental policy making. And the conservation communities are a great source to be tapped for the nature-based climate solutions. And the international collaborations on conservation has generated great resources in fostering the epistemic community, and we should encourage more collaboration at the people level for exchange of science and policy expertise. And just echoing the previous speakers, I think a radio ally for those conservation community is the general public and civil society. While China follows the strong state-led top-down environmentalism, public engagement and participation will be essential to tackle the complex issues such as conservation and climate change. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. Just on that issue of experts, actually, one question that came through was how are negotiators at the CBD COP15 kind of set up adequately to be able to do that role? Is it kind of as well established as the negotiators for the UNFCCC, for example? How kind of, is that going to be sort of a gap? Is that going to be a limitation of the CBD COP15, the experts in the negotiating team?
I'll quickly provide a remark. I just unmuted myself to provide one point for the previous question, but I think now since I'm muted already. So quickly on the previous one, I just wanted to add one point, which is it's really important that when we sense that positive trend in terms of actions, to recognize the higher level of commitment at policy, national level particularly, that really sets the direction for driving actions in terms of subnational governments level actions, and also driving the direction where capitals would flow. I just wanted to give one example, like in China, we really see the rise of renewables as a sector coming up. And that really, I mean, it's very closely linking with the country's commitment and announcement 2060 carbon neutrality goal. I think that's important to recognize. So very quickly on the experts one, Helen, you just raised this question. I think each country probably have a slightly different setup, but I think the setup of these teams are very much similar among different conventions within country level. In China, I know I actually work closely in terms of at project level with China's CBD Preparation Committee. We do have some project collaboration, and they have very strong technical team as part of the committee in support of that discussion. So just a quick remark on that one.
Great, thanks, Han. Did anyone else have any comments on that? Catalina?
Yes, thank you, Helen. No, indeed, I think as Han mentioned, each country has a different way of setting up their negotiator kind of systems and consultations. At the global level, we have carried out several regional and thematic consultations that have been open to all parties to be able to continue to learn and discuss and dialogue around the issues that will be significant in the context of COP15 and the post-2020 framework. There have been numerous discussions also with the co-chairs in which the co-chairs have set up stakeholder dialogues and discussions, bringing to the forefront the interface with biodiversity conservation and agriculture, for example, another session on climate change, and just recently this month, one with the financial sector. So there have been different opportunities to build that scope of kind of holistic, comprehensive viewpoints on the importance of this post-2020 framework for country negotiators. Now, I can't compare this with the UNFCCC. I do know there are different means that have been put in place, for example, in the context of COVID. And we have been engaging very closely with our sister secretariat to understand more of the provisions that have been made available. We're looking into these types of scenarios and provisions to provide in the context of future virtual type of meetings. So there has been a lot of exchange right now to see what we can bring from the UNFCCC context to help the expert negotiators in the follow-up meetings that are preceding the COP itself. Of course, we all have been impacted by virtual meetings, and some delegations more than others because of time zones and because of connectivity issues. So these are other factors that we as a secretariat are looking into and discussing closely with other convention secretariats to see how we mitigate the impacts to the negotiators and find alternative means for all participants to be able to effectively contribute and discuss on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Catalina. Ruth, did you have something to add on that one?
Yeah, 2 quick points, I think. I think one of the sort of big challenges around the biodiversity, kind of engendering and in the CBD is the kind of dependence on an understanding and data on the ground about what is actually happening in your ecosystems and in the biodiversity that you have in kind of many of the world's kind of most diverse countries, that maybe some of the world's poorest countries in certain circumstances. So there is a kind of like profound thing about the nature of the expertise that means that you can only be really as good as the investments that we collectively make in actually understanding the biodiversity on the ground, and that will act as an impediment to implementation until we actually recognize and do more to invest in that space. Though I do think actually my experience as the CBD negotiators is that they're an extraordinarily kind of erudite bunch, I have to say, but they're still, contingently dependent on that science on the ground. And then I think the other thing that is sort of worth recognizing is that in the world of biodiversity, we're in the foothills of a conversation about how you create kind of norms around, kind of investment in particular that can begin to drive this sort of big global transition of financial flows. And, we're some way down the conversation in the climate world about what it means to be net zero. We're not very far down the question in the biodiversity world of what it would mean for a financial institution or a corporation in a particular sector to be really contributing strongly to these outcomes and how they can actually measure that and report against it. We're beginning to get there with things like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which is working very closely with colleagues in the CBD. But this is an early stage discussion, and I think one of the places where we're going to see much more focus over time, and where the complexity and local specificity of the biodiversity issues are going to make this sort of particularly rich, but actually genuinely tricky area to operate in. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. I was wondering, given the timeline, so we've got the CBD COP15 in October, and then the UNFCCC COP26 in November, how much are the targets sort of codependent? So, for example, are the COP26 negotiations going to be heavily influenced, or at least partly influenced, by what comes out of the CBD COP15? And we also have a question linked to that. So what are the most appropriate mechanisms to ensure climate and biodiversity synergies are realised, and how best to head off the risk that carbon pricing /CBAM/climate financing achieves climate mitigation objectives at the expense of less prominent biodiversity objectives? So yeah, I'm interested in those links there, if anyone has any comments to add on that.
I'm going to hop in with one sentence while folks are thinking about it. Just on that last point about the risk of kind of perverse outcomes or trade-offs if you drive through a climate agenda without having a biodiversity agenda that is equally sort of kind of well developed. I'm just going to point back to my previous answer. The reason that you need to be able to focus on having like a really clear framework of targets for biodiversity that can then be translated into national action, but very specifically translated in action by financial institutions and by corporate players, is precisely to avoid the kinds of trade-off that we're thinking about. So we all have a vested interest actually in investing in the economic transition around nature agriculture as well as the economic transition around climate in this quite detailed and specific way that drives change in the private sector, because that's the way we're going to avoid some of those perverse outcomes, I think. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. Any
Yes.
more? Catalina, yeah, please.
Yes, well, I think the question had to do also with the process. And first, the two secretariats, the climate and biodiversity secretariats, have been discussing on a regular basis in terms of all these impacts. We are all kind of working towards the best approach moving forward to these COPs. So I think one message I'd like to give the participant that asked the question is that indeed there is effective dialogue between the secretariats. I think there is also dialogues between the two host countries to really see how things can be in sync. We not only look at the COPs, but also we have the UN Food System Summit that is happening in September. We have the IUCN Congress as well that is going to be producing a lot of inputs that are extremely relevant for the CBD and the climate convention. So there's a lot of integral coordination and discussions that are happening to effectively make sure that we're able to show the connections and that there is coherence in what the policymakers are providing, but also on the mechanisms that will be available to ensure that implementation does hit the ground. And I think that's where our kind of the most important aspect goes towards how do we get more coordination at the ground level to ensure that implementation is effectively answering these global frameworks. In that context, obviously, accountability mechanisms and review mechanisms will be very important. For the CBD, that is one provision, and that is an implementation support mechanism that is being negotiated as well as part of the post-2020 framework. So that would be one aspect, one tool and mechanism that would be quite necessary for us to leverage, and parties are discussing that so that they can leverage that from the global standpoint, but also ensure discussion on how they work around their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, the updating of those national strategies and action plans, as well as the frequency and reporting on them. So there's a lot of important discussions currently happening. And in that context, I also think, as Ruth has mentioned, data will be very important. Understanding what would be effectively contributing to, one, reducing the drivers of biodiversity loss, but also looking at opportunities and measures that can effectively put biodiversity on a path back to recovery by 2030. And I mentioned in my intervention a combination of measures that have been mentioned through our 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook that are necessary to tackle this issue in a more holistic way. So it's not just climate change, addressing climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and planting more trees, or looking at the ecosystems in a silos. We also have to look at pollution. We also have to look at invasive alien species. We have to look at the overexploitation of specific natural resources, as well as looking at how do we transition our productive systems in agriculture so that we can generate the types of products and goods that are needed, but in a way that is in unison with biodiversity. And at the same time, how do we lower our footprint in terms of consumption and waste? So it is a package issue, and we're hoping more and more that with the data, with partnerships, and with integration, this type of mindset can become more visible. We can try to work towards more dashboards that can show how we're effectively moving in these different very important pillars of change that are required, not just for biodiversity, but for climate change as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Catalina. And we're actually out of time already. That went very, very quickly, and a really fascinating set of presentations. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists again, Ruth, Lee, Han and Catalina. Thanks very much for spending your time with us today. It was really engaging and interesting. And thanks so much to the audience for all of the questions. And sorry that we didn't get a chance to answer all of them. Thanks again, everybody. Bye.